What would happen if a porn addict got so fed up with his addiction and being a victim of this compulsive consumption that he snaps, goes all the way to the other side, leaves his life behind, goes to India, and then spends thousands of hours sitting in silent meditation and engaging with other ancient contemplative practices? We're about to find out, because that is the story of today's guest on the Quit by Healing podcast, Jeremy Lipkowitz. His quest to overcome porn addiction led him to make radical changes in his life. And on the way, he found himself in deep and close examination of the mind, of awareness, and of the true source of suffering. These days, Jeremy teaches a method for overcoming addictions that is inspired by Buddhist philosophy and based on mindfulness and acceptance. I highly recommend that you listen to this entire episode, because Jeremy keeps delivering fascinating insights from his journey, and he also translates those insights into practical advice that you can use right away. So without further ado, here is Jeremy Lipkowitz. So Jeremy, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for making the time for this.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start with what is a moment that probably everyone or most people listening to this can relate to, which is, what was the moment in your life where you realized my porn use is a problem? This is where it's not just, oh, it's fine, it's just something I do, where you're like, oh no, this is something I have to fix. This is a real addiction. When did that happen for you?
For me, there's a very clear moment. It was kind of a turning point in my life. And I remember I forget how old I was, in my early 20s, maybe 23, 24. And I was still a young student in Davis, California. I was working on a degree in genetics. And I remember walking down the street. It was a beautiful day, like blue skies, the sun was out. My life was going great. I had a lot of friends. I was a stellar student, captain of a sports team. So everything in my life was good. And I remember very clearly walking down the street, and I remember seeing in front of me these two girls walking ahead of me. And I remember staring at the asses of the girls in front of me. And in that moment, I was so consumed by my lust. I was just overwhelmed with desire and longing and thirst and craving. And it was in that moment that a few things happened. One is, I realized that the experience of lust itself is a state of suffering. You know, this experience of wanting something that you don't have is a state where you're ignoring all the beautiful things in your life. You're not focused on your friends, the blue skies, all the good things. You're just focused on, I need to have that thing, and unless I have it, I can't be happy. The other thing it did for me is it made me realize that, you know, if I don't change something about the way that I'm living, I'm going to be some perverted old man who's trying to hit on college girls at bars when I'm 70. Like, I really saw that future for myself. I realized, hey, you know, I'm getting older, but I'm still kind of attracted to college girls, and I just saw that future for myself. And I realized in that moment that my porn habit, which was a daily habit, you know, every night it was an hour to 2 hours, and I realized that that was cultivating this lust, this sexual desire in myself. And so I realized that I needed to make a change, because it was this experience of realizing I had everything in my life that I wanted. Everything I put my mind to, I could accomplish. And still I was unhappy. And so I realized if I wanted to be happy, I needed some fundamental change to how I was living. And that, you know, that really opened up my eyes to the porn addiction problem.
That's really interesting, yeah, because I think that is one of the subversive things about it is, as long as you're in denial, you might say that, oh, I'm doing this because it feels good. Right? Why am I jerking off to porn every day? Well, because it feels good. But you got to the point where you realize, hold on, this is not making me feel good. This is actually causing suffering. And I think that's a difficult leap to make. So what you're describing sounds like it's a moment of awareness. And I often think that, well, awareness is one of the tools, is one of the most important tools you can wield against an addiction. But it's also something that addiction cuts you off from, because it puts you in this unaware automatic mode. How did you arrive there? How were you able to have this moment of awareness? Did you do any work, or how do you explain that to yourself? Right? How were you able to do this?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it really begs the question is, where does that first moment of awareness come from? Because you can be in denial and you can spend your whole life not realizing it. And I had done some meditation. My friend had brought me to some Tibetan centers where I'd learned how to meditate a little bit. And so I had a few moments of opening up to awareness, but I had always been a pretty introspective and reflective person. And actually, there was one moment before that was kind of the door creaking open, which was, there was a moment maybe a year before where I remember walking out of a classroom, and I would often check girls out, like to put it in my spank bank for later. I was like looking around and seeing who was attractive and staring at their butts. And I was doing it semi on the sly. I wasn't a total creep about it. But I remember this one moment where a friend of mine, we were sitting outside the classroom, this big auditorium had just gotten out, and he and I were talking. And apparently I was kind of checking out girls while I was talking to him. And he just turned to me and he said, "Dude, you've got a staring problem." And in that moment, it was him shining a light on something and me realizing, hey, my lust is actually, it's not in control. And I thought I was hiding it, but apparently I wasn't. It was taking over my behavior. And so that was the first sign of like, hey, something's a little bit out of whack here.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's when it starts, it's almost like it starts creeping its way out of you, right? It starts in private, but then it starts creeping into your life, and suddenly you've become the person who's constantly staring at girls and can't pay attention to anything else. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned earlier, it's like for a lot of people that are in denial, they think, well, I'm just going to keep doing this because it feels good, right? And in the moment, porn feels good. But I started noticing so much inner turmoil from my sexual desire. Wherever I went, there was this sense of, it was this tightness that I was experiencing of always wanting and never feeling satisfied. Even though I was, ended up sleeping with a lot of attractive women, it was never enough. Like nothing ever felt truly satisfying. And that was painful. It was like I wanted this sense of happiness. I wanted contentment. I wanted to be satisfied, like genuinely satisfied. Yeah. And so there were just all these little holes starting to cut into the screen.
I want to dive right into something that is kind of deep and advanced, but this is one of the things I do on the podcast. I often call this, slightly ironically, this is the adult content. Like this is the content for adults. We go a bit deeper, right? If you look at my TikToks and whatever, I'm very focused on just keeping people's attention who have no attention span. Here, this is the real shit, right? So let's get into this, because when you talk about the problem of you're checking out these girls and this desire is the cause of suffering, one thing I think we need to talk about is a term that comes to mind is hungry ghost. This is hungry ghost behavior. You're forever wanting. And even when you're having sex with some of those girls that you maybe checked out, you still want more and more and more. It's never enough. There's a very important distinction to make here, because one topic that is important for the work I do, and I'm sure for you as well, is shame. And it's easy to go, oh no, now I've become this creepy dude, I'm checking out girls, and to shame yourself for it. For me, it's really important. This is something I had to learn as well. It's like to make a delineation between like a healthy, natural desire. You notice a beautiful woman, there's nothing wrong with that. Don't shame yourself for that. But there's a difference between seeing a beautiful woman, appreciating her beauty, and having that hungry, graspy, oh, I want more, more, more. Or you see it, and here's one thing that I think is a clear distinction, right? If you see a beautiful woman and you're here present, seeing her and appreciating her, that's healthy. If you see her and then you start fantasizing, basically you leave the present moment and you're, oh, what does she look like naked? Oh, I bet she'd be, I would love to fuck her or whatever. Now you've left the present and you're almost trying to escalate. You're trying to turn her into porn, right? And that is the unhealthy behavior. That is the thing that also causes suffering. Because just being present to, there's a beautiful woman here, that doesn't cause suffering, right? You have to, there's like another step involved. So yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
100%. I mean, I'm in total alignment with what you're saying. I like to talk about the difference between lust and attraction. And just as you say, attraction is normal, it's beautiful, and it's one of the things we have to do if we want to break free from porn is let go of that shame and learn how to embrace your sexuality in a healthy way, which includes being attracted to other people. And so really understanding on an internal, very granular level, the difference between lust and attraction is so important. And as you say, that lust is this kind of very clingy, graspy, I want to obtain, I want to accomplish, I want to own that thing. Versus attraction is just that appreciation. And learning how to tap into that and make space for that it's tough work, but it's part of the healing work and recovery. Is saying, hey, I'm a sexual being, and that's a beautiful part of being human. There's nothing wrong with that. But learning, some people will take that too far and say, oh, well, sexuality is normal. Let me feed into it as much as I can. And there's no limit to it. But that's also not healthy. It's like you have to know where the balance is. And the hungry ghost thing, that was such a huge turning point in my life, understanding that concept of the realm of the hungry ghost.
So,
knowing that.
Can you explain it to us in your words? How does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so, in Buddhist philosophy, there are these different realms of existence. There's like the heavenly realms and the hell realms, and then there's the human realm. And, for some people, they think they're actual places that you go. For me, it's more these are different mind states or different kind of places you drop into in your own experience. And one of the realms is the realm of the hungry ghosts. And it's this realm of these creatures that walk around with these big distended bellies, these huge bellies, and tiny little mouths. And so no matter how hard they try, they can never fill themselves up enough to feel satisfied because their mouths are so small and their bellies are so big. They're constantly wandering in these desert areas, kind of looking for enough food to satisfy them. So they're never satisfied. And that's how much of my life felt. It was like, no matter how much porn I watched, no matter how many sexual encounters I had, it never felt like enough because I always wanted something new. I'm sure you talk about this. I talk about this as well. Modern day porn, it cultivates a dependence on novelty. Yeah. Because every night you log on, you're looking at hundreds or thousands of different videos and faces, and every new face gives you that dopamine hit. And so you become accustomed, your brain starts wanting novelty. And that's the thing that gets you off. So that's what I had noticed for myself, was just this never feeling satisfied.
Yeah. Yeah, another aspect of your story here that I think is super valuable to go into a bit is that you, like you said, your life, let's say on paper, from the outside, your life is going great, right? You're doing great academically, you have friends, you're athletically successful, you have sexual encounters with women. Like you're not using porn because you're always alone, but you're not using porn because you're like you have no sexual, you don't have a sex life, right? And this is something I want to get into because a lot of the people that I encounter through this work it's often young guys who would imagine that life as being the solution. So they would say, well, look, I'm struggling at school, I don't have a job, or I hate my job, I don't have a girlfriend, or maybe I've never had a girlfriend, I feel super unattractive. And so all of these things are going wrong. That's why I'm feeling bad. And, I wouldn't do porn if I had the life that you described, right? So let's go into that. So basically, what would you say to one of those guys? It's like, why were you doing porn?
Yeah.
You had it all.
And it's fascinating because it's true that, especially with porn, there's no way to tell from the outside who is struggling with porn addiction or compulsive porn use because it's so many high achieving people that you would never suspect. And there's a few reasons for that. One is it's easy to hide. It's easy to, kind of sweep it under the rug and nobody can see it. In terms of why I had this addiction, first we need to talk about, first of all, what is an addiction and where do addictions come from in general. An addiction is any habit or behavior that you continue to do despite negative consequences. And it's really important to look at the overall impact of the behavior being negative. Because any behavior, particularly for addictions, has some benefit that it's bringing into your life. Stress relief, anxiety relief, distraction, maybe a way to deal with trauma. And so it has some benefit, but when you look at the overall consequences, it's causing more harm than the good that it's doing. And you keep doing that despite those consequences. So the question is, why do we become addicted? Any addiction comes from, and I really do believe this, the inability in your past to deal with some kind of pain or discomfort. And the behavior was a form of helping you deal with that pain. And so it might be emotional trauma from your childhood. It might be, you were teased at school. Maybe your parents, were abusive. It can be anything that you didn't know how to deal with. And porn gave you some relief from that, gave you some sense of control, some sense of pleasure or distraction. And so in this way, anything can become an addiction for someone. And so for me, early in my childhood, porn was my way to self-medicate. And later on, it just became a crutch that was there for, since I was 8 years old, 9 years old. And so it kept going. Even when the rest of my life started looking successful, it was still the thing that I used to self-medicate, to deal with stress and anxiety.
Yeah, yeah. And that's also the hungry ghost thing, is like, it feels like the solution is I need more, but the truth is it's never going to be enough. And it's, for me, it's, I guess, somewhat similar in that I was that, I didn't get good grades. I wasn't successful in basically any area of my life. And I discovered porn early on, and I used it as well as this kind of, it's kind of a painkiller. I often think of it as a painkiller. It's like, I'm in pain. Porn gives me temporary relief. And then I became successful in, name it, basically in all areas of life I care about. I became successful, somewhere between successful and very successful. And I did not stop using porn, right? It's like, so I was in the same situation where it's like, why would you do this from the outside? This doesn't make sense. And it's only if you understand, well, this is a coping mechanism. And I'm also usually dealing with some pain that's from the past, probably, or right. It's also not a rational choice. But I do think at the core of it is like this illusion that if I had a girlfriend, or if I could have sex with lots of women, or if I were more successful, or if I were whatever it is, right? You think that if I only had that thing, it would like fill that hole in me, and then I'd be complete. And it's never, ever going to work that way. And so that, which brings us to, if that's not the solution, if this external stuff is not the solution, if getting the perfect GF is not the solution, then what is it? What did you discover? How did you get yourself untangled from this?
Yeah. Well, I love that you used the word untangled, because in that story that I mentioned earlier, where I was walking down the street, saw these two girls and was just kind of overwhelmed by my lust. One of the things that happened is I had this existential crisis, right? I had this moment of thinking, I have everything in my life that I've ever wanted. I can accomplish anything I put my mind to, and yet I'm still unhappy. And so it got me really interested in the topic of happiness and just fulfillment and well-being. Like, is it even possible? And so I started reading a lot of books about positive psychology, happiness, spirituality, purpose. And I found this book on meditation, and it introduced to me the concept of neuroplasticity, which was one of the most important turning points in my life, understanding neuroplasticity. And essentially, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's the understanding that we have now that your brain is constantly changing and forming new connections throughout your life. And in particular, that what you're doing with your mind, what you do with your attention, you are strengthening neural pathways with your thoughts and with your attention. And so what I realized is that every time I logged on to porn, I was strengthening the neural pathways of lust and desire and craving. And I had been doing this for a decade. Every night I was hardwiring these neural pathways of lust. And so that for me was an important turning point, because I realized, one, that I was the cause of my own suffering. I was putting on the bricks of my own prison and keeping myself trapped there. But it also showed me a way out, because you can use neuroplasticity to train the mind to break free, to break down these different neural pathways and to start forming healthier ones. The neural pathways associated with contentment and equanimity and resilience and all of these things that actually genuinely bring happiness. So for me, understanding the role of meditation and mindfulness and neuroplasticity is one of the most important things you can do, training the mind and rewiring the mind as a way to break free. And part of that,
Yeah.
just as you mentioned, porn being a painkiller, we have to learn more skillful emotional management techniques. If you don't know how to be with discomfort, whether it's physical discomfort or emotional discomfort, then whenever physical or emotional discomfort comes, you're going to reach out to your medication. So we've got to learn these other strategies of like, okay, when I'm feeling uncomfortable, how can I deal with this in a skillful way rather than just trying to numb out with porn or drugs or whatever it is?
Yeah, I really like that explanation, because it also, you're going right to the core of it by saying, okay, I'm training my brain to essentially generate this state of forever hungry, forever dissatisfied lustfulness. That state of being is something I'm training like for hours a day, right? Like, no wonder I'm so good at it. And
Exactly.
And it is an amazing way to think of it. And I think that's also a powerful frame to apply, neural plasticity, or the way I think of it is essentially you get better at anything that you do repeatedly. And the tragic thing is that, especially for a lot of younger people who maybe grew up in front of a screen, like, you maybe are familiar with the concept of 10,000 hours of practice lead to mastery, roughly. And for a lot of people, the only thing you've ever put 10,000 hours into is consuming stuff on a screen. You've maybe put 10,000 hours into jerking off to porn. You've maybe put 10,000 hours into scrolling through a feed, right? So you've gotten really, really good at that. Your whole, so much of your being is like so specialized on that. And then ask yourself, well, how is that creating the life and the experience I want? Because, we call it doom scrolling for a reason. We don't call it bliss scrolling, right? Nobody's actually having a good time. And you're training your brain for that thing. And equally, you could train your brain. This is how I relate to this. I've trained my brain to be grateful for years and years and years now. Every day I do a gratitude exercise. Every day. So I have put, and I don't know how much it would be in hours, but I've put thousands of hours into just practicing being grateful. And guess what? I'm really good at it now. I constantly feel grateful for all kinds of stuff that most people don't even notice, right? And that is a much better thing to train your brain to do than to be constantly grasping for more and more and more on a screen. So, yeah, I think it's a really great way to frame this. And thank you for sharing that. That's really good.
Yeah, I think I just want to touch on one of the things you said, which is thinking about, what do you want to be the default mode of your mind? And for me, I had noticed that the default mode, wherever I went, my default pattern was I walk into a room, I scan the room to see who's attractive so I can kind of check them out and pornify them and objectify them. And then I started having lustful thoughts. And that was my default mode. And what I wanted my default mode to be was connection, compassion, contentment, gratitude, these states of mind that contribute to well-being. That's the future that I wanted. And just like you said, you just have to train the mind in that way.
Yeah. And it's reliable, right? Your mind will get better at the thing that you repeatedly do. It's very, very reliable.
Yeah. And this, to kind of dive into for me, what was very helpful was the framework of Buddhist philosophy. And I remember there was this one quote that I read in that book on happiness. And it was, related to neuroplasticity. It was the quote that said, neurons that fire together wire together. And so that was the neuroplasticity. But I realized that even, 2,500 years before that, the Buddha had said something very similar. He said, what you frequently think about and ponder upon becomes the inclination of the mind. Mm-hmm. And so it's like we have ancient wisdom traditions that have known this for millennia. Mm-hmm. And it's like the thing that you keep doing with your mind, that's going to become the inclination of the mind. So be very careful with your thoughts.
Yeah. So can you, in a practical sense, how did you do this? So how did you retrain your mind?
So I was fortunate at that time. I had just graduated from UC Davis with my degree in genetics, and I was taking a year off before going to grad school. I ended up going to grad school at Duke, working on a PhD, but I took a year off and was fortunate enough to go to India during that time. And I spent about 3 months traveling through India, particularly in the north. And I started going on these meditation retreats, and I started really understanding my mind and training my mind in a formal way. And so I went on my first Vipassana retreat, which is one of these, 10 to 11 day silent retreats where there's no talking or reading or writing. And that was the start of it for me. That was me realizing, hey, there's a method, a way to train my mind. What was also helpful about that trip to India, it gave me space from my day-to-day routine. So many years later, now that I've done a lot of research and study into addiction and recovery, I understand this is something we call behavioral architecture, where you really are thoughtful about the things you're putting in your environment. And sometimes having a total change to your environment is helpful just to reset any triggers that might be there. So for me, going to India was a way of resetting my environment where I could really take a break from my triggers, from my routines, and have that time to let my brain heal. And I went through, my first 60 days without masturbation, without porn, and that was really helpful to have that space in there.
What was your experience of doing a long silent retreat where you're just sitting with your thoughts for like 10 days in a row? And
it was horrible.
It was horrible. Tell us.
One of the worst things I've ever done. One of the most challenging things. A lot of people who have never been on one, they think, oh, it's like going on vacation. You get to relax. It's easy. But it's honestly one of the most challenging things you could ever do. You have no distraction from the insanity going on in your head, from your own, childishness and pettiness and annoyances and regrets, and all the things, come up when you're sitting there for 10 days. And so it's challenging, but that's the point of it. I really want people to understand this. The point of meditation is not to always feel good. The point of meditation is that when you don't feel good, you know how to be there with it without running away from it. You're training in this skill that we call equanimity, which is the skill of, hey, this is unpleasant and I don't need to run away from this. Yeah. Or, hey, this is something that's really pleasant, but I don't need to chase after this. That skill of equanimity, that's what we're cultivating. And so retreats are painful and unpleasant, but they're that way on purpose.
Yeah, the skill of equanimity, I think, is such a powerful tool to have, because I've repeatedly, in a way, life has repeatedly taught me this lesson. And in recent years, I started paying attention, is that when something unpleasant arises and you want to make it go away, or you resist it, like that's really where the suffering comes from, right? And I think, you can really experience this. For example, if you're a porn addict, you can experience this with your urges, right? You feel the urge, you get triggered, you feel the urge to watch porn. It's like your resistance and all of the noise you make about it, that's why it's so hard, right? It's like, oh no, this is happening. Oh, I'm going to relapse. It's going to be so terrible if I have to do this thing puts you in this state that it's pure suffering, right? If you just go, okay, there's an urge, and what does it feel in my body? Maybe I feel like something in my groin. Maybe I feel it in my chest or something, right? This feeling is actually quite bearable. It's actually fine. You could, if someone told you, I'm sorry, you're going to feel like this for the rest of your life, you'd be like, you probably have worse pains, right? Especially if you're slightly older, you probably have like a little bit of back pain or something that's way worse than that. You live with that, no problem. It's your resistance to it. That's why you're suffering so much. I've seen this over and over again. And this is one of the reasons I really like certain exercises like fasting, where you fast and you'll have these periods of discomfort. It's like, I really want to eat, and you're grumpy and stuff. And you're just like, it's fine. I'm just going to continue doing my work grumpy and hungry. It's perfectly fine, right? And it can train this skill, which again, I mean, what you're mentioning is, I really want to underline these things you're mentioning, because that's such a life skill. If you're good at this, your life is so much better.
Yeah, and just as you said, it's like fasting can be a pathway to that. Ice bath can be a pathway to that. Going to the gym. And for me, this is what meditation is about. It's just a way to practice, hey, being uncomfortable. And, every moment you do that, you're strengthening those muscles of equanimity. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's super helpful to do something difficult.
Yeah, so through this skill in Buddhist leaning meditation. It sounds like you managed to get clear of your own addiction. What was that like for you? Like, was this like a long drawn out process? Or, I mean, you went to India and you did all this stuff. So was it kind of ripping off the Band-Aid?
For me, well, it's interesting. The part of going to India was ripping off the Band-Aid. I would say there was about maybe a year before I went to India that was me battling with it of, hey, this is a problem, but I'm still doing it. And then during that time, I was reading a lot more on neuroplasticity and meditation. And then when I went to India, that's when I ripped off the Band-Aid. And that was the thing that allowed me, again, to have that space to reset my triggers. And that was the thing that really started my recovery in a real way. But there was probably 6 months to a year before that where it was a little bit back and forth, trial and error, trying to quit and not being able to.
Okay, and then since at some point you started working with people, so now you help people essentially use a similar approach, presumably, to overcome their addiction. Here, I'm wondering, like, what did you discover once you started working with clients? Because like your own story is case study number one, and then you start working with clients, you get all these other case studies. What are some things that you noticed, in your work, what are some things, some patterns that you noticed that, that keep coming up that are different maybe from your own story?
I think one of the things that I didn't know at the beginning when I was doing my own recovery that now is a very important part of the work I do with clients, because, I can't recommend all of my clients to, hey, go fuck off to India for 3 months and, ordain as a monk and do all these things. Yeah. So one of the things that I've learned is so critical is the importance of cultivating, a healthy, fulfilling life overall. Having a sense of purpose, having a sense of meaning, or, a value-driven life, having good social connections and friendships where you can be vulnerable. And, it's not just me kind of making this up and saying, hey, you got to have a good life. Like, there's some really interesting research that highlights how important this is. So there's this one famous study called the rat park experiment. Have you heard of the rat park experiment? Yeah, it's one of my favorite. And so just in case your listeners haven't heard it yet, they were studying the effects of, I think it was morphine back in the 70s or 80s, and they were looking at the effect of morphine in rats. And so they would give these rats water laced with morphine, and they found out that the morphine water was so addictive, the rats would sit there and drink the water essentially until they died. So it just showed how strong addictions could be. But then this one researcher had this idea. He said, these rats are living in these cages. It's pretty miserable. They're not living happy lives. What if we give them a rat park where they can run around, they can play with other rats, they can have sex, they get to go on the running exercise wheels. And when they did that, they found that the rats barely touched the water. And that having a life where you feel happy, where you feel fulfilled, where you have social connections, where you're exercising, where you're living a good life, addiction doesn't pull at you as strongly. And so that's so important for the recovery work we do. It's like making sure that the life you're living is a fulfilling life. And the most important things there are social connections, exercise, and eating healthy, just living a healthy life.
The funny thing about the rat park experiment is that it's still a bit controversial to say this about humans, because we have, when it comes to things like addictions and depression and things like that, which often go hand in hand as well, so addiction and other mental health issues, we really favor, in our culture, we really favor like the brain chemistry explanation. Oh, there's just some brain chemistry is like misaligned, right? And if you take this pill and then we get whatever, this neuromodulator upregulated and you'll be fine. Where what the rat park experiment implies is that maybe there's something in your life, right? That maybe the reason you're depressed is that you're lonely, and you need to fix that. You don't. It's not a pill, right? It's not just I need more serotonin in my synapses. It's not. No, you need friends, right? And I think that's often very, very true. Like these mental health issues, including addiction, are often they're a symptom of something else going on that needs fixing in your life. And yeah, like you say, this is not, it's not a bonus suggestion. This is a core part of the solution. So how can we help someone get there, right? So your typical addict is like, okay, how do I go from here where I'm addicted, I'm hungry, ghosting, and maybe I have some of these problems, maybe I'm disconnected socially and stuff. How do I go from here to fixing the porn problem and improving my life overall? Yeah, what's your recommendation here? Because it feels like a daunting task.
It is a daunting task. And first, I just want to say, to all the guys out there listening who are still struggling, it's like to acknowledge the struggle. It's not an easy one. There are literally billions of dollars being put in to make you become addicted to these substances. And when I say substances, a lot of people don't think porn is a substance, but it is. You're ingesting it through your eyes. It acts on the same neural pathways of dopamine. And so there's $1 billion industry behind this trying to keep you addicted. And so just first of all, to normalize, if you're struggling, like, hey, you're not alone. You're not like weak-willed. This is just part of the world that we live in.
Yeah.
Then it's like, if you want to say, okay, what do I do first? There's a few things. And we talked about this earlier, but I really think learning how to let go of sexual shame and learning how to let go of shame in general, of, you're not a bad person because you watch too much porn. You're not a bad person because you want to watch porn. And when that urge arises, when lust arises, to not beat yourself up, but just as you said so beautifully earlier, it's like, oh, okay, lust is here. Where do I feel it in my body? Or, is this a sign that I need something right now? Maybe I'm longing for some connection with another human. So letting go of shame and embracing your humanity, embracing your sexuality is probably the first step, because if you don't do that, anything else you do, it won't go very far. Then the next thing to do is, focus on your fundamentals. The fundamentals being exercise is the most important, moving your body, going to the gym, even if it's just doing 5 push-ups at home every morning. It's like getting something that makes you feel confident in yourself, makes you feel like you're doing work for yourself and improving your life. And then also making sure that you are giving your brain time to heal by decreasing or maybe even cutting out porn completely. So, if you are a small seedling trying to grow, but you keep pouring poison on it, you're not going to be able to grow. And so you have to give your brain time to heal. And so doing a detox, like a 30-day detox, a 60-day detox, where you're just trying and putting in that effort to stop watching porn, is going to give your brain time to heal. And you might not be perfect, and that's okay. If you try to do a 30-day detox and you make it 5 days before your first relapse, that's fine. Just get back on and start again. Like, don't let one relapse derail you. What I like to say to my clients is the total time free from porn is more important than your streak.
Yeah.
It's like, doesn't matter if you have a relapse, just like get back on it and start again.
Yeah, exactly. I like to compare this to exercise, where, of course, ideally, you have an exercise program, you follow it every day, and that's going to lead to the result you want, right? But I think everybody can clearly tell, like, if I followed my program perfectly for 2 weeks and then I skip one day and then I go back to training, it's not a huge setback. It's not like I lose all of my gains, right? And it's exactly the same, because we are talking about brain training, right? You're training your brain to be in a different mode, and skipping one day is not a setback to zero. And so, and in fact, if you think it is, then you go, oh, well, I might as well give up. And then you skip the next 4 weeks, and then you've arrived back at zero, right? So I think that's a very important insight. It's like, just, okay, nobody's perfect, but just keep, like, go back to your training, right?
I love the way you say it. Like, when you put it in that analogy, it makes it so clear. Like, yeah, obviously, if you have a month-long exercise training program and you skip one day, but then you just get back on it and continue on for the next 2 weeks, you're much better off. Yeah. And when you look at it that way, it's so obvious. It's the same with porn. It's like, yeah, whatever, you relapse one day, but you're still training yourself. Just get back and start again.
I really like your message. And obviously we're very, very aligned here, because, I can see that you're also coming from this kind of acceptance-based place, right? which I think is unfortunately the quieter message. There's quite a lot of messaging in the space about that's kind of shouty about nofap and sometimes religiously motivated. It's sinful to touch yourself and stuff, which just adds to the shame, basically, right? Regardless of your beliefs about this, is in that sense, it's not helpful to add another source of shame on top of it, and the masculinity stuff and whatnot, right? I feel like it's unfortunately much easier to find a less gentle and ultimately less helpful message about how to approach this. So I'm really glad that you're doing this work and putting this message out there. Is this also, just out of curiosity, is this something, have you seen this in your clients where maybe they come in with some of these ideas of really beating themselves up horribly about, or feeling like, oh, this makes me, I'm not a man because I relapsed or something like that? Do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you bring up. And you're right, there's a lot of, I like the way you called it, shouty stuff out there that's more vocal, whether it's coming from a religious bent, or there are certain recovery programs that are more shame-based and shame-oriented. And there are people who have that feeling in them. It's like, oh, I'm sinful if I fantasize about someone. And there's a certain extent of like seeing people like you and me talking about these things and being open about it and saying, hey, there's nothing wrong with your sexuality, and embrace it. I think that alone can be very healing for a lot of people, to see another man talk about it in this way. And it's almost like a breath of fresh air, like, oh, wow, okay, like I don't have to push away my sexuality. I don't need to suppress it or hide it. And for some people, that's a very big hurdle to overcome, because of years of conditioning from their childhood, from maybe a religion. It's very hard to get to that place of embracing their sexuality. And that is probably one of the big stumbling blocks for a lot of people.
It definitely was for me. That was the biggest part of the struggle for me, was that I just noticed it's just so much shame around my own sexual desires, a lot of it that I don't even understand where it comes from, and that was also a big reason why I was so addicted to porn, is because it felt like porn was the only safe outlet. So it felt like my sexual desire is this kind of dangerous, predatory thing almost that I have to protect the world from. And I very much felt super guilty about feeling sexual desire towards a woman and feeling like, well, yeah, this is unwelcome. She doesn't want this. This is gross of me, right? And so in a way, porn is like, that's the outlet. That it's almost like I'm saving all these poor women from my sexual desire, or at least that's what it feels like, right? By directing it towards these women that don't feel real on a screen, right? But then, of course, part of the problem is that it gets you on that flywheel of generating more and more of. It basically generates more desire, right? Because you're getting better at generating the desire that you then need the outlet for, and generating it again, and so on. And it leads to the over-sexualized mind, which is also something that's fairly well studied. That the more you use porn, the more you tend to think about sex. And so yeah, it's one of those things where you're shooting yourself in the foot, but you don't realize it. But the main point being, like, for me, this was almost like the emergency exit. What can I do with this shameful thing inside me? Oh, here's a safe place where I can direct this, right? Mm-hmm. And without getting to the bottom of that, I could have never, ever quit this addiction. There's just no way. There's nothing I can, and the kind of nofap thing where it's just like, I'll try super hard to not do it. No, that's never going to work unless I get at that core problem.
There's so many beautiful things that I want to touch on of what you said. First of all, as you're saying, like, yeah, the monk mode, nofap, just fight through it and use willpower. Obviously, I think people who listen to you and me understand that that's not a successful way to overcome addiction. Maybe you'll be able to have like a 2-week streak or a 1-month streak, but you're just suppressing things. And as we talked about earlier, what you suppress grows stronger. What you resist persists. The the topic of shame, particularly around sexuality, is so fascinating because there is something uniquely shameful around sexuality. You know, it's like, even in the story of Adam and Eve, I'm not a religious person, but it's like the first thing that they did was cover their genitals, right?
Right.
It's like that instinct, like it's like page 2 of the Bible or something. It's like, yeah, and then they covered up because they were ashamed.
Right.
So there's something like very inherently, like almost biologically, we're kind of wired for this. Like we have to hide our sex. And it's interesting because, you know, it's one of the few addictions that we really do hide from other people. Like people are alcoholics in public. People will take drugs in public, smoke in public. But could you imagine just walking down the street and just seeing people have sex in public? It just doesn't really happen. So there's something about it where we do feel, hey, I need to hide this. I can't just, you know, be public with this.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you were saying, and I resonate with this, that, you know, part of you felt so ashamed of your masculinity that it was almost like, okay, I'm going to look at porn so that I can save these women from my toxicity almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, that's like the saboteur is telling you to do that. But really the saboteur just wants an easy, quick fix of dopamine and, you know, the feeling of intimacy without the fear of rejection. But the biggest gift we can give to women is to be fully embodied in our healthy sexuality.
Yeah.
You know, not to run away and then have this unhealthy thing, but it's like, if we really want to be of service to our, you know, our female counterparts, the biggest thing that we can do to be of service is like integrate and heal, and then be a man who's grounded in his sexuality and knows how to offer that gift from a place of, you know, an open hand rather than a graspy, clingy kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, letting go of shame, it's just as you said, it's that first step.
Yeah, yeah. And this is really the path I hope we can lead people down, right? Where you go, okay, this is not just about removing porn from your life. This is about going all the way to the other side, where you become that male that you just described, right? Where you have this grounded, healthy, you're grounded and healthy in general, which includes a grounded and healthy sexuality, and where you can experience the sexual aspect of your life in a way that is not grasping, it's not hungry ghost, and that's also then what makes it not creepy. Because if you are in that grasping, desperate, shameful mode, and you maybe you're slightly drunk or something, or you overcome the courage and you kind of project that at someone, it can often come across as gross or creepy or dangerous. And so you'll get that reaction that reinforces, oh my God, oh, what did I do? It's so shameful. But if you can actually be fully grounded and you can express your desire for someone in a way where it's like, I want nothing from you, right? There's just this desire here. And like you said, open hand, right? It's here, but I don't need anything from you. And that it's very much a sub-communication when she can feel like you are not going to like press yourself on her. You're not going to like run after her. You're not going to do anything weird or creepy or dangerous, when it suddenly becomes a welcome and beautiful thing. And that is so incredibly missing for most men. Like, who learns this nowadays, right? But I love that you bring this up, because for me, that's the other side of the journey. The journey starts with, oh crap, I'm addicted to porn, I need to do something about it. But if you keep going, you can get to that other side, and it's beautiful and it's worth going there.
Yeah. And, you know, just as you're saying that, the ability to really be grounded in your presence, you know, and to not come with that clingy, graspy kind of energy. You know, if we want to talk about attraction and dating, all this, it's one of the most attractive things that you can do is to just be so grounded that you don't need the other person.
Yeah.
You know, you can express an interest and say, oh, I find you attractive. Would you like to go on a date? And if they say no, you're totally cool with that. That's the most attractive thing. It's like it's the most beautiful gift you can give yourself and the other person. And it makes you a more attractive man.
Totally, yeah. Yeah. All right, Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing all this. I really feel like this is full of gems. I didn't expect that the discussion would go here, but I love that it did. So the last thing I want to ask is, if people want to learn more from you or maybe work directly with you, where should they go? Where can people get more Jeremy?
I think probably the best place to check me out now is just on my own podcast, which is called Unhooked. I'm also on Instagram. And if you want to work with me, I do offer one-on-one coaching. I have an online program, but we're closing the doors in 2 days from now. So I don't think by the time people listen to this, it'll be available. But I would say just come swing by my Instagram or my podcast and check me out there.
Perfect. Okay. And we'll, of course, also link to that in the show notes. So in this episode, in the description, in the show notes, you can find the links to that. So yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy, for sharing with us. I really love this. I really love where we went with this. So thank you for your time, and hopefully to see you again in a future episode as well.
Yeah, I would love that. And it's really been a pleasure. And I love the work that you're doing online, and particularly on like TikTok and all the stuff. So it was a pleasure to be here.
All right, that wraps up today's episode. I really loved this conversation, and I hope you did too. You can find the link to Jeremy's Instagram and his YouTube channel and everything else related to his work in the description of this podcast episode. Or you can just search for The Unhooked Podcast in your favorite podcast app, and you should see it come up right there in your search results. So go check him out. There is a lot more you can learn from him. And also, if you enjoy the kind of content that I'm putting out, please leave a review, leave a star rating, leave a like or a comment, or do whatever else you can do on the platform where you're listening to this to tell the algorithm, hey, I'm engaged, show this to more people. You know how this works, right? Algorithms basically run the world. I'm trying to get this message out to as many people as possible, and your reviews, comments, likes, and so on make a huge difference. Thank you, and see you in the next one.